My name is Clara, and at 35, I thought I knew what humiliation felt like, until my husband mocked my cooking in front of his colleagues and suggested he'd be better off eating at his secretary's place. The laughter that followed wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a turning point. What Richard didn't realize as he smirked across that dinner table was that I wasn't the woman he thought he'd married anymore. Some meals take minutes to prepare, but the one I was about to serve him, that had been simmering for months. By the time I was done, he'd be the one on his knees, and trust me, it wouldn't be to propose. If you're watching this, let me know in the comments if you've ever had a moment that made you stop seeking approval from people who never wanted to give it, and like and subscribe for more stories. The afternoon light streaming through the dining room windows caught the crystal glasses just right, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the white tablecloth. I adjusted the placement of the wine glass at the head of the table for the third time, stepping back to assess my work with a critical eye. Everything had to be perfect. The silverware gleamed, polished until I could see my reflection in the backs of the spoons. The napkins were folded into elegant peaks, crisp white against the cream china that had been Richard's grandmother's. Even the salt and pepper shakers stood at attention, exactly 3 inches from the edge of the table, symmetrical as soldiers. I had been planning this dinner for weeks. Richard's colleagues from the firm were coming, important people, he'd stressed, people who mattered to his career. His tone when he'd told me suggested that I was somehow a liability, a variable that might embarrass him if not properly managed. The implication stung, but I swallowed it down like I'd learned to swallow so many things over the past few years. In the kitchen, I fussed over the roast chicken, basting it one more time though it didn't really need it. My hands trembled slightly as I prepared the herb butter, and I hated myself for being nervous. This was supposed to be my domain, the one place where I excelled, where I could shine. I'd spent the morning making sure every detail was accounted for. The wine pairings, the appetizers, the timing of each course. Even the playlist was curated, something sophisticated but unobtrusive, just loud enough to fill awkward silences, but quiet enough to allow conversation. Richard wandered into the kitchen, already dressed in his expensive navy suit, his tie knotted with the casual perfection of someone who'd been doing it since prep school. He barely glanced at me as he opened the refrigerator and pulled out a beer. "Don't stress, Clara," he said, not looking up from his phone. "Just don't burn anything." The words landed like a slap, casual and cutting all at once. I felt my chest tighten, but I forced my face into a smile. "It's going to be wonderful," I said, my voice steady despite the humiliation coursing through me. "I've been working on this menu for days." He made a noncommittal sound and disappeared back toward the living room, leaving me alone with the steam rising from the pots and the hollow feeling in my stomach. I gripped the edge of the counter and took a deep breath. I would prove him wrong tonight. I would show all of them, that I was capable of more than he gave me credit for. The doorbell rang at precisely 7 o'clock. I wiped my hands on my apron, checked my reflection one last time in the hallway mirror, and opened the door with my most gracious smile. Richard's colleagues filed in with the practiced ease of people accustomed to social gatherings. There was Martin from accounting, Tom from acquisitions, and Sarah from legal. And then there was Melissa. Melissa was Richard's secretary, though she preferred the title executive assistant. She was younger than me by at least 5 years, with that effortless sort of beauty that didn't require much maintenance, glossy dark hair that fell in perfect waves, skin that glowed without heavy makeup, and a figure that her dress clung to in all the right places. She smiled at me as she entered, but there was something proprietary in the way she immediately gravitated toward Richard, laughing at something he said before he'd even finished the sentence. I noticed. Of course I noticed. But I pushed the discomfort down, buried it beneath layers of practiced hospitality as I took coats and offered drinks and made sure everyone felt welcome in my home. Dinner began well enough. The appetizers were praised, my stuffed mushrooms and the brie and croûte that I'd spent an hour perfecting. Conversation flowed easily, lubricated by the wine I kept pouring. Richard held court at the head of the table, telling stories from the office, and I played my part perfectly, the attentive wife, laughing at the right moments, asking interested questions, keeping the wine glasses full. Then came the main course. I brought out the roast chicken with a mixture of pride and trepidation, setting the platter down in the center of the table. It looked beautiful. Golden brown skin, herbs nestled around it, the vegetables roasted to caramelized perfection. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel accomplished. "This looks wonderful, Clara," Sarah said, and I could have kissed her for that kindness. Martin and Tom murmured their agreement as I began to serve. I was halfway around the table when Melissa cut into her portion, took a small bite, and tilted her head thoughtfully. "It's a little dry," she said, her voice light and casual, as if she were commenting on the weather. "But I'm sure it's hard to get chicken just right." The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt my face flush, but before I could respond, Richard let out a laugh. Not a polite chuckle, but a genuine bark of amusement that made everyone turn to look at him. "Maybe I should start eating at Melissa's place," he said, his eyes glittering with something that looked like mischief, but felt like cruelty. "At least she can cook." The room erupted in uncomfortable laughter. Not real laughter. The kind that people produce when they don't know what else to do, when they're witnessing something that makes them squirm but they're too polite to call it out. Sarah's laugh was strained. Martin looked down at his plate. Tom took a sudden interest in his wine glass. But Melissa smiled. A small, satisfied smile that she didn't quite manage to hide. I sat frozen in my chair, the serving spoon still in my hand, feeling as though I'd been punched in the stomach. The humiliation was so acute I could taste it, metallic and bitter on my tongue. Every insecurity I'd ever had about my marriage, about my worth, about my place in Richard's life, came rushing to the surface all at once. But I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't let them see me break. Instead, I lifted my wine glass with a hand that barely trembled and smiled. Really smiled, the kind of smile that reached my eyes even though everything inside me was screaming. "You're right, darling," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Maybe you should." The laughter died immediately. Richard's smile faltered for just a second before he recovered, but I saw it. Everyone saw it. The balance of power in the room had shifted, just slightly, just enough. I took a sip of wine and let the moment settle. My eyes traveled around the table, catching each face in turn. Sarah looked away quickly, embarrassed. Martin cleared his throat. Tom suddenly became very interested in buttering his bread. Only Melissa met my gaze, and there was something calculating in her expression, something that confirmed every suspicion that had been growing in the back of my mind for months. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of forced conversation and brittle politeness. I served dessert, a chocolate torte that no one could find fault with, and made small talk and played the perfect hostess, while something inside me quietly shattered and then, just as quietly, began to rebuild itself into something harder, something sharper. After dessert, as guests began to help clear the table despite my protests, I saw Richard and Melissa together in the hallway. They weren't doing anything obviously wrong, just standing close, talking in low voices, their heads bent together. But there was an intimacy to the moment that made my stomach turn. The way his hand almost touched her lower back. The way she looked up at him through her lashes. The way they both seemed to forget, for just a moment, that anyone else existed. I turned away and walked into the kitchen, my arms full of plates that clattered slightly as I set them on the counter. My hands gripped the granite edge, knuckles white, as I closed my eyes and tried to breathe through the rage and hurt that threatened to overwhelm me. "At least she can cook." The words echoed in my head, but they weren't just words anymore. They were a message, a declaration. He wasn't just mocking my cooking. He was telling everyone that I was replaceable. That someone else, someone younger and prettier and more convenient, could do better. That I wasn't enough. The guests began to leave around 11. I stood by the door, smiling and accepting compliments on the dinner with grace, thanking them for coming, promising we'd do it again soon. Lies. All of it, but lies delivered with such sincerity that no one questioned them. When the last guest had gone and the door finally closed, Richard headed straight for the bedroom without a word. No thank you for all my work. No apology for humiliating me in front of his colleagues. Nothing. I stood alone in the dining room, surrounded by the debris of the evening. Wine-stained napkins. Lipstick prints on glasses. crumbs scattered across the perfect white tablecloth. The ruins of my perfect dinner. But as I began to clear the table, something shifted inside me. A clarity settled over me, cold and sharp as a knife blade. I had reached a crossroads. I realized I could continue being the dutiful wife he underestimated, the woman who swallowed every insult and kept smiling. Or I could do something else. Something he would never see coming. I folded the tablecloth with careful precision, smoothing out each crease, and carried it to the laundry room. My face in the darkened window reflection was calm, serene even. But my eyes held something new, something dangerous. A resolve had taken root, and I would nurture it carefully, quietly, until the time was right. The morning after the dinner, I woke to an empty bed. Richard had already left for work, which wasn't unusual, but he hadn't even bothered to leave a note. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the previous night in excruciating detail. When I finally made my way downstairs, I found Richard's coffee mug in the sink, unwashed, and the newspaper scattered across the kitchen table. No acknowledgement of the hours I'd spent preparing dinner. No recognition of the effort I'd put into making everything perfect. Nothing. He came home that evening full of praise for the dinner, but not for me. "You know, Clara, Melissa was the hit of the party," he said, loosening his tie as he headed for the liquor cabinet. Everyone at the office today was talking about how witty and charming she was. She really knows how to work a room. I was chopping vegetables for salad, and the knife paused midair. "I see," I said quietly. "I'm glad everyone had a good time." "Oh, they did," he continued, oblivious to, or perhaps deliberately ignoring, the edge in my voice. "Melissa said she had a wonderful time. She's really something special." The knife came down harder than necessary, splitting the cucumber clean through. "She certainly seems to have made an impression." Richard either didn't catch my tone, or chose not to. He poured himself a scotch and disappeared into his study, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a growing suspicion that had begun to calcify into certainty. Over the following weeks, I started to notice patterns. Richard's late nights at the office became more frequent. He'd always worked long hours. It came with the territory at a high-powered law firm, but now there was a different quality to his absences. He'd come home after 9, sometimes after 10, smelling of cologne I didn't recognize and with a brightness in his eyes that never appeared when he looked at me anymore. "Team dinner," he'd say, or "client meeting ran late," or "had to finish up some briefs." Always an excuse. Always plausible. But the frequency was escalating, and Melissa's name seemed to pepper every conversation. "Melissa helped me with the Johnson file today." Melissa found that precedent I needed. Melissa suggested this great new restaurant downtown. It was like she'd become his co-lead in a play where I'd been demoted to background extra. One evening, while Richard was in the shower, his laptop sat open on the kitchen counter. I wasn't the snooping type, had never been, but something pulled me toward it like gravity. My hands shook as I tilted the screen up, fully expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. His calendar was open, the one he used for both work and personal appointments. I scrolled through quickly, my heart hammering against my ribs. There they were, recurring entries labeled team dinner and strategy session, scheduled every Tuesday and Thursday evening. I clicked on one. The location made my stomach drop, an upscale bistro 3 blocks from Melissa's apartment building. I knew where she lived because Richard had mentioned giving her a ride home once when her car was in the shop. I heard the shower shut off and quickly closed the laptop, moving back to the sink where I'd been washing dishes. My hands trembled as I scrubbed the same plate over and over, trying to process what I'd seen. When Richard emerged, toweling his hair, he didn't even glance at me. I needed to talk to someone before I went completely insane. The next day, I met my best friend Lydia for lunch at our favorite cafe downtown. She took one look at my face and ordered us both wine instead of coffee. "What's wrong?" she asked, leaning forward with concern creasing her forehead. I told her everything. The dinner party, the humiliation, the late nights, Melissa's omnipresence in Richard's life, the suspicious calendar entries. Lydia listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail. "Clara," she said when I finished, her voice tight with anger on my behalf. You need to confront him. This is textbook affair behavior. You can't just sit back and let this happen. But I shook my head, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice.
No.
If he wants to play games, I'll change the rules. But on my terms, not his. Lydia looked at me with a mixture of concern and something else. Respect. Maybe. What are you going to do? I don't know yet, I admitted. But whatever it is, he won't see it coming. The next week, I decided to try one more time. I spent an entire day preparing an elaborate meal. Richard's favorite, actually. Coq au vin with all the trimmings, homemade bread, a salad with the complicated vinaigrette he loved. I set the table beautifully, lit candles, even put on a dress he'd once told me he liked. 6 o'clock came and went. Then 7. Then 8. I sat at the dining room table, watching the candles burn down, the food growing cold on the plates I'd so carefully arranged. I didn't call him. I didn't text. I just sat there, watching the wax pool and thinking about what a fool I'd been. He strolled in at 10:30, his tie loose, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder. The scent hit me immediately. Perfume. Not mine. Something floral and young and unmistakably Melissa. I'd smelled it on her at the dinner party. Oh, he said, noticing the table. Did we have plans? Did we have plans? As if I were some casual acquaintance he'd forgotten to put in his calendar, not his wife of 8 years. I made dinner, I said, my voice flat. I ate already, he replied, heading toward the stairs. Team dinner. I mentioned it this morning. He hadn't. We both knew he hadn't. But I didn't argue. I simply stood up, began clearing the table, scraping the untouched food into the trash with methodical precision. Richard was already upstairs, probably scrolling through his phone, already having forgotten the scene entirely. But I hadn't forgotten. I wouldn't forget. The next few weeks were a masterclass in death by 1,000 cuts. At work functions I attended reluctantly, I watched Richard and Melissa interact with a growing sense of unreality. They weren't even subtle anymore. She'd touch his arm when she laughed. He'd lean in close when talking to her, closer than necessary. Other people noticed too. I caught the uncomfortable glances, the way conversations would pause when they walked up together, the knowing looks exchanged behind their backs. But no one said anything. No one wanted to be the one to acknowledge what everyone could see. Richard's criticisms of me escalated, each one a tiny erosion of the person I used to be. This is bland. He'd say about my cooking. Can't you do something more interesting with your hair? God, Clara, do you have to be so boring all the time? Each jab chiseled away at me, but I trained myself not to react. I'd smile, nod, make a noncommittal sound, and file the insult away in a growing catalog of grievances. Outwardly, I remained the calm, dutiful wife. Inwardly, something was crystallizing, something cold and patient and absolutely certain. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening. Richard had left his coat draped over the banister, and as I went to hang it up, something crinkled in the pocket. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. It was a receipt from a restaurant I'd never been to, expensive, the kind of place Richard usually reserved for special occasions.
Tout entrée.
A bottle of champagne. And on the back, in handwriting I recognized from the expense reports I'd sometimes helped Richard organize, were 4 words in Melissa's distinctive script. Next time, my place. I stood there in the hallway, holding that receipt, and something inside me went perfectly, crystalline still. Not rage. Rage was hot and messy and uncontrolled. This was something else. This was clarity. I didn't scream. I didn't confront him. I didn't burst into tears or throw things or any of the dramatic responses a wronged wife might have in a movie. Instead, I very carefully took a photo of the receipt with my phone, put it back exactly where I'd found it, and hung up Richard's coat. Then I went to my desk, a small secretary in the corner of what Richard called my crafts room, as if my hobbies were somehow less important than his work, and I pulled out a clean notepad. At the top, I wrote a single word: evidence. Below it, I began to write
Dates. Times.
the calendar entries I'd seen, the perfume I'd smelled, the receipt. Melissa's handwriting. Every suspicious late night. Every casual cruelty. Every piece of the puzzle that had been forming in my mind for months. My pen pressed so hard against the paper it nearly tore through, but my handwriting remained steady, controlled. I filled 3 pages before I stopped, reading back over what I'd written with a kind of detached fascination. It was all there, laid out in black and white. The evidence of my husband's betrayal and his casual destruction of our marriage. But more than that, it was the foundation of something else. A plan. I didn't know what form it would take yet, not entirely. But I knew it would be precise. It would be devastating. And it would be perfectly, undeniably justified. When Richard came home that night, late again, of course, I was sitting in the living room with a book, looking perfectly peaceful. He barely glanced at me as he headed upstairs. I listened to his footsteps on the stairs, the sound of the bedroom door closing, and I smiled to myself in the darkness. He thought I was weak. He thought I was defeated. He thought I would simply accept this slow dissolution of our marriage, fade quietly into the background while he started his new life with his secretary. But Richard had made a critical error. He'd underestimated me. And by the time he realized his mistake, it would be far too late. I closed my book and went to my desk, pulling out the notepad again. There was work to be done, pieces to be positioned, a stage to be set. And I had all the time in the world to do it right. Because revenge, I was learning, was a dish best served cold. And I intended to make it a meal he would never forget. I began studying Richard the way an anthropologist might study a newly discovered tribe, with clinical detachment and meticulous attention to detail. Every morning, I noted what time he left for work. Every evening, I documented when he returned, what excuses he offered, whether he smelled of perfume or wine or both. I kept the journal hidden in a box of old recipe cards in the kitchen, reasoning that Richard would never look there. He'd long since stopped paying attention to anything I did in that room. The journal became my confidant, the only place where I could be completely honest about what I was seeing, what I was feeling, what I was planning. Each entry was dated and timed. Each observation was recorded with precision. I was building a case, though I wasn't entirely sure yet what court I'd be presenting it to. But information alone wasn't enough. I needed allies, even if they didn't know they were allies yet. Richard's colleagues had always liked me. I'd made sure of that over the years. I was the wife who remembered birthdays, who asked about their children by name, who sent thank you notes after every firm event. But after the disastrous dinner party, I began cultivating those relationships more deliberately. A coffee here, a lunch there, always casual, always friendly. I never mentioned Richard or Melissa directly. I didn't have to. People talked when they felt comfortable, and I was very good at making people feel comfortable. From Sarah in legal, I learned that several people at the firm were uncomfortable with how much time Richard spent with Melissa behind closed doors. From Martin in accounting, I discovered that Richard had been submitting unusually high dinner expenses, always for 2 people, always at restaurants nowhere near the office. From Tom in acquisitions, I heard whispers that Melissa had been bragging about her close relationship with one of the partners. None of them said it outright, but the message was clear. I wasn't imagining things. Everyone could see what was happening. They were just too polite or too cautious to say so to my face. At home, I began making subtle changes that Richard barely noticed. I organized our home office, creating neat files of important documents. I reviewed our bank statements carefully, noting patterns in withdrawals and expenses. I pulled out our insurance policies and read them cover to cover, paying particular attention to the language about asset division. I wasn't planning anything specific yet, but I was preparing. For what? I wasn't entirely certain. But I would be ready. One Saturday, Lydia dragged me to brunch at a new bistro downtown. Richard was at the office, again, though I'd stopped believing his excuses weeks ago. Over mimosas and eggs Benedict, Lydia studied me with concern. "You're too calm," she said finally. "It's freaking me out." "Would you prefer I fall apart?" I asked, spreading jam on my toast with deliberate care. "I'd prefer you to show some emotion. Anger. Sadness. Something." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're scaring me, Clara." Before I could respond, Richard appeared in my peripheral vision. He was walking down the sidewalk outside, laughing at something on his phone, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife was sitting in the window of the restaurant he was passing. But what made my stomach clench wasn't Richard. It was the woman walking beside him. Melissa, wearing a sundress and sunglasses, her hand brushing against his arm as they walked. I must have made some sound, because Lydia followed my gaze and let out a low curse. That son of a... It's fine, I said, my voice steady despite the ice spreading through my chest. Let them have their day. Clara. No, really. I turned back to my food, cutting my eggs with surgical precision. Because I'm not done cooking yet. Lydia stared at me for a long moment, then a slow smile spread across her face. Okay then, what do you need from me? What I needed was time and patience, and a plan that was still forming in the corners of my mind. But what I said was, just be ready. When I ask for your help, I'll need you to say yes without asking questions. Done, Lydia said without hesitation. Absolutely done. The next phase of my plan required something I'd never been particularly good at: boldness. But I was learning that necessity reshapes us in unexpected ways. I started experimenting in the kitchen, new recipes, exotic flavors, complex techniques I'd never attempted before. To Richard, on the rare evenings he was home for dinner, it looked like I was desperately trying to improve my skills. He'd make condescending comments about my cute little cooking projects and then barely touch the food I'd spent hours preparing. But the experiments weren't about food. They were about precision, about following complex instructions, about understanding how small changes in technique could produce dramatically different results, about learning to trust my instincts and my abilities. I was teaching myself that I was capable of more than I'd believed. One evening, as I plated an elaborate duck confit that Richard would undoubtedly ignore, he looked up from his phone long enough to smirk. You don't need to bother impressing me, Clara. I'm a lost cause when it comes to your cooking. I smiled serenely. I'm not cooking for you, darling. He blinked, confused, then shrugged and went back to his phone. He didn't ask who I was cooking for. He didn't care. And that indifference was the nail in the coffin of whatever affection I'd once felt for him. The opportunity I'd been waiting for came unexpectedly. I ran into Melissa at a cafe near Richard's office, purely by accident, though I'd been making a habit of stopping there on my way to meet Lydia for our standing Wednesday coffee date. She was alone, waiting for her order, scrolling through her phone with a small smile that made my blood simmer. Melissa, I said warmly, as if we were old friends. What a coincidence. She looked up, and for just a second, something like guilt flashed across her face. But she recovered quickly, matching my smile with one of her own.
Clara. Hi.
How are you?
Wonderful. Elite Muesli.
Do you have a moment? I'd love to buy you a coffee. She hesitated, clearly torn between self-preservation and curiosity. Curiosity won.
Sure.
That would be nice. We sat at a small table by the window, two women who might have been friends if circumstances were different. I let the small talk flow naturally, the weather, weekend plans, a new exhibit at the art museum. And then, as if it were the most casual observation in the world, I dropped the line I'd been rehearsing for days. Richard has always been such a flirt, hasn't he? I said lightly, stirring sugar into my latte. He does it with everyone. It's almost charming in a way. Melissa's smile sharpened. With me, it's different. The certainty in her voice was like a confession. She wanted me to know. She wanted to claim him, right there in front of his wife. The arrogance of it was almost breathtaking. I'm sure it feels that way, I said gently, as if humoring a child. Then I gathered my purse and stood. Thank you for the chat, Melissa. It was illuminating. I walked away without looking back, but I could feel her eyes boring into my spine.
Good.
Let her wonder what I meant. Let her feel the first whisper of uncertainty. The encounter energized me in a way I hadn't expected. I went home and pulled out my journal, adding notes from our conversation. Then I opened my laptop and began researching. Divorce lawyers, financial advisors, private investigators, though I ultimately decided I had all the evidence I needed. What I was looking for now was strategy, how to dismantle a marriage and a reputation with maximum efficiency and minimum collateral damage to myself. I found what I needed in a series of articles about asset protection and marital fraud. I made notes. I bookmarked pages. I created a folder on my laptop labeled Recipes, Advanced, and filled it with documents that had nothing to do with food. Then I began gathering documents. I made copies of our tax returns, bank statements, credit card bills. I photographed Richard's expense reports, the ones he sometimes brought home to review. I noted the hotel bookings that appeared on our credit card statements, always single occupancy rooms, always on nights when Richard claimed to be working late at the office. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was too hot, too reactive. What I felt was something colder and infinitely more dangerous. Certainty. The certainty that I was right. The certainty that I had been wronged. The certainty that I would make this right on my terms. One evening, as I sat at my desk organizing my evidence into neat folders, physical and digital, I realized I was ready for the next phase. It was time to set the stage. Time to invite the audience. Time to prepare the meal that would change everything. I pulled out my phone and began composing a message. I'd love to host another dinner party. Let's do it right this time. I sent it to Richard before I could second-guess myself. His response came almost immediately. Sure. Your call. Just make it good this time. I smiled at the screen. Oh, I would make it good. I would make it unforgettable. I opened my calendar and found a date 3 weeks away, enough time to prepare everything perfectly. I circled it in red pen, pressing down hard enough to nearly tear through the paper. The game was about to begin, and I was going to win. The 3 weeks before the dinner passed in a blur of meticulous preparation. I sent invitations, elegant, cream-colored cards with embossed lettering, to Richard's colleagues, Sarah, Martin, Tom, and of course, Melissa. I also included a few people Richard wouldn't expect. James from HR, who I'd met at a company picnic and whose wife I'd stayed in touch with, and Patricia, the firm's senior partner, who'd always been cordial to me at events. Richard raised an eyebrow when I showed him the guest list. Patricia? Isn't that a bit ambitious? She told me at the last company dinner that she'd love to see our home. I lied smoothly. In truth, I'd called her assistant directly and extended the invitation, mentioning that it would be a small, intimate gathering. Patricia had accepted, probably out of politeness, more than genuine interest. But she'd accepted. And James from HR? His wife and I are friendly, I said, which was technically true, though we'd only exchanged pleasantries and holiday cards. I thought it would be nice. Richard shrugged, already losing interest. Whatever you want. Just make sure the food is actually good this time. I didn't respond. I simply smiled and returned to my planning. The day of the dinner, I woke at dawn. I'd been too keyed up to sleep well, my mind running through every detail of the evening ahead. I'd spent the previous day preparing everything I could in advance, stocks and sauces, desserts that needed to set, appetizers that could be reheated. Today was about execution. I moved through the house like a general inspecting troops before battle. The dining room was pristine, the table set with our finest china and crystal. The flowers I'd arranged that morning were perfect, white roses and eucalyptus, elegant and understated. The wine was chilling. The playlist was cued. Every detail was accounted for. In the kitchen, I worked with a calmness that felt almost eerie. My hands didn't shake as I prepared the final components of the meal. I'd chosen the menu carefully. Dishes that were elegant but not showy, impressive but not pretentious. A spring pea soup with mint, herb-crusted lamb with fingerling potatoes and roasted asparagus, a lemon tart for dessert, and a folder. A plain manila folder that sat on the counter, waiting. Richard came downstairs around 5, already dressed in slacks and a button-down. He looked good, he always looked good. That had never been the problem. Smells great, he said, surprising me. He came up behind me and kissed my cheek, a gesture so unexpected I almost flinched. You've really outdone yourself. It was the perfume, I realized. He smelled like Melissa again. He'd probably been with her that afternoon, some last tryst before playing the doting husband for his colleagues. The kiss was guilt, or maybe just habit. Either way, it meant nothing. "Thank you," I said evenly. "I want a night to be perfect." "It will be," he said confidently. "And Clara, thank you for doing this. I know entertaining isn't your favorite thing." The lie was so casual, so automatic, that I wondered if he even knew he was lying. Entertaining used to be something I loved, something I was good at. But he'd stripped that joy away with his constant criticism, his casual cruelty.
Well,
Tonight, I would reclaim it. Guests began arriving at 7. Sarah and her husband came first, bearing wine and compliments. Martin arrived alone, his wife away visiting family. Tom brought his partner, a kind-faced man named David who immediately complimented the house. James from HR arrived with his wife, Karen, who hugged me like we were old friends. And then came Melissa. She wore a dress that was just a shade too revealing for a dinner party, black and slinky, cut low enough to turn heads. Her hair was loose and glossy, her makeup perfect. She looked like she was going to a nightclub, not a colleague's dinner party. But more than that, she looked confident, possessive, even, as she air-kissed Richard's cheek and complimented him on his tie. I watched the exchange with detached interest, noting how Richard's hand lingered on her elbow, how his eyes tracked her as she moved into the living room. Several of the other guests noticed too. I saw Sarah exchange a glance with her husband, saw Martin's expression tighten. Finally, Patricia arrived, dignified in a pearl gray suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. "Clara," she said warmly, clasping my hands. "What a lovely home. Thank you so much for including me." "The pleasure is entirely mine," I said, and meant it. Patricia's presence changed the dynamic of the evening in ways the others didn't fully understand yet. But they would. Dinner began smoothly. The soup was praised, the conversation flowed, the wine glasses were refilled regularly. I played my role perfectly, the gracious hostess, attentive but not overbearing, making sure everyone felt included and comfortable. And then came the main course. I presented the lamb with quiet pride, and this time, there was no feigned politeness in the compliments. The meat was perfectly cooked, pink in the center, the herb crust fragrant and crispy. The vegetables were caramelized to perfection. Even Melissa couldn't find fault with it, though I saw her searching for something to criticize. But Richard couldn't help himself. As plates were being passed and conversation continued, he raised his glass and smiled around the table. "Let's all be careful, folks," he said, his tone playful but with an edge that made my spine stiffen. "Clara's cooking is, well, let's just say it's an acquired taste." The words hung in the air like smoke. A few people gave uncomfortable laughs, the same kind of laughter that had followed his joke at the last dinner party. But this time, something was different. This time, Sarah's expression darkened. James and Karen exchanged a glance. Patricia's eyebrows rose ever so slightly. Even Melissa looked uncomfortable, though she tried to hide it with a sip of wine. I smiled serenely and said nothing. I simply continued serving, making sure everyone had what they needed. But inside, something clicked into place. The moment had come. The stage was set. The audience was assembled. Dessert was served to genuine enthusiasm. The lemon tart was beautiful, delicate, and perfectly balanced. As I began slicing it, I excused myself briefly to the kitchen, ostensibly to prepare coffee. When I returned, I carried not just the coffee service but a small folder, the same manila folder that had been sitting on my kitchen counter. I set it down next to Richard's dessert plate with a sweet, almost affectionate smile. "I made something special for you, darling," I said, my voice warm and intimate. "Something I've been working on for weeks." Richard looked confused, glancing from me to the folder and back again. "What is this?" "Open it," I said gently. "It's a gift." The table had gone quiet, all eyes on Richard as he hesitated, then reached for the folder. I saw Melissa stiffen in her seat, as if some instinct warned her of what was coming. Richard opened the folder. Inside were copies, careful, organized, annotated copies. Receipts from restaurants, hotel bookings from our credit card statements, printouts of his calendar showing the recurring team dinners that coincidentally corresponded with dates on the restaurant receipts. Expense reports from his firm showing charges for meals that matched those same receipts. And at the very top, protected in a clear sleeve, the receipt I'd found in his coat pocket, with Melissa's handwriting on the back. Next time, my place. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face went through a remarkable transformation: confusion, then comprehension, then red fury, then a pale, sickly white. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, and I watched with detached fascination as he realized exactly what he was looking at. Not just evidence of an affair, but evidence of expense fraud. Personal meals charged to the company. Hotel rooms billed as business expenses. All of it documented, dated, organized. Around the table, reactions varied. Sarah's hand had flown to her mouth. Martin was staring at Richard with undisguised disgust. James, the HR representative, had gone very still, his professional mask firmly in place, but his eyes sharp and assessing. Patricia was reading one of the papers that had slid across the table, her expression unreadable, but her posture rigid. And Melissa. Melissa had recognized her own handwriting on that receipt, and the color had drained from her face. She looked from Richard to me and back again, realizing too late that she'd been caught. I poured wine with a steady hand, the crystal decanter catching the candlelight. "Please," I said to the table at large, my voice perfectly composed, "enjoy the tart. It pairs well with truth." "Clara," Richard began, his voice strangled, but I held up a hand. "No, please. Don't let me interrupt dessert. I know how important good food and good company are to you. After all, you've been enjoying so much of both lately." I let my eyes drift to Melissa, who seemed to shrink in her chair. "Haven't you?" Richard's hand slammed down on the table, rattling the china. "How dare you," he hissed. "How dare you humiliate me like this? In front of my colleagues?" The irony was so perfect I almost laughed. "Humiliate you? Oh, Richard. I learned from the best." Patricia cleared her throat, and the sound cut through the tension like a knife. "Perhaps," she said in her crisp, authoritative voice, "we should give Richard and Clara some privacy." But James spoke up before anyone could move. "Actually, Patricia, I think I need to see those documents." His voice was professional but firm. "If company funds have been misappropriated, HR needs to be involved." Richard's eyes went wild. "This is a personal matter." "The expense reports make it a company matter," James said calmly. He looked at me. "Clara, may I?" I nodded and gestured to the folder. James pulled it across the table and began reviewing the contents with the careful attention of someone trained to spot irregularities. Patricia leaned over to look as well, her expression growing progressively more severe. Melissa stood abruptly. "I should go." "Sit down, Melissa," Patricia said without looking up. It wasn't a request. Melissa sat. The next several minutes were excruciating for everyone except me. I felt strangely calm, almost peaceful, as I watched my carefully assembled evidence pass from hand to hand. Sarah's husband was a lawyer. I'd known that when I invited them, and I saw him studying the documents with professional interest. Martin looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Tom and David were whispering to each other in low, shocked tones. Finally, Patricia looked up. "Richard, I think you and I need to have a conversation. In private. On Monday morning." "This is ridiculous," Richard blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Clara is being vindictive. She's trying to ruin me because you've been cheating on me with your secretary and using company money to do it." I finished calmly. "Yes, darling. That's exactly why." The truth, laid bare, was devastating. There was no coming back from it, no spin that could make this look like anything other than what it was. Patricia stood, her napkin folded neatly beside her plate. "Thank you for dinner, Clara." It was illuminating. She looked at Richard with something like pity. "I'll expect you in my office Monday at 8 a.m. Don't be late." She left, and her departure seemed to break the spell. One by one, the other guests began to make their excuses, gathering their things, avoiding eye contact with Richard and Melissa. Sarah squeezed my hand as she left. "You're stronger than I thought," she whispered. "Call me if you need anything." James was the last to go. "I'll need to keep these," he said, holding up the folder. "For the investigation." "I have copies," I assured him. "Multiple copies." He nodded, something like respect in his eyes. "I bet you do." And then they were gone. All of them, leaving just Richard, Melissa, and me in the wreckage of what had been meant to be a perfect evening. Richard exploded the moment the door closed. "You bitch," he snarled, advancing on me. "You vindictive, petty bitch. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I stood my ground, meeting his fury with perfect calm. "Yes," I said simply. "I've done what you should have had the decency to do months ago. I've told the truth. I'm your husband." "And she," I said, pointing at Melissa, who was crying silently in her chair, mascara running down her cheeks, "is your secretary." And yet somehow, I'm not the one who forgot what that meant. Richard opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He looked like a fish gasping for air, drowning in the consequences of his own actions. "Get out," I said quietly. "Both of you, get out of my house." Melissa didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed her purse and fled, her heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. The front door slammed behind her. Richard stood there for a moment longer, his face a mask of impotent rage and dawning fear. He was realizing, I think, exactly how much trouble he was in. Not just with me, but with the firm, with his career, with everything he'd spent years building. "Clara," I said, "get out." He left. And I stood alone in my dining room, surrounded by the remains of the dinner party, listening to the sound of his car starting in the driveway, the tires squealing as he pulled away too fast. Then and only then did I allow myself to feel it. Not triumph, exactly. Not satisfaction. But something quieter and deeper. Relief, maybe. Or vindication. I'd set the table. I'd served the meal. And I'd watched Richard choke on every bite of truth I'd fed him. It was exactly what I'd promised myself I would do. And I wasn't finished yet. The house felt different after everyone left. Quieter, yes, but also lighter somehow, as if exposing the truth had lifted a weight I hadn't fully realized I'd been carrying. I moved through the dining room mechanically, stacking plates, gathering silverware, the muscle memory of cleanup providing a strange comfort. My phone buzzed constantly, texts from Sarah, from Karen, even from Tom's partner David offering support. I ignored them all for now. There would be time for that later. For now, I needed to finish what I'd started. I was loading the dishwasher when I heard Richard's car pull back into the driveway. My stomach clenched, but I didn't stop what I was doing. He burst through the kitchen door like a storm, his face mottled with rage and something that might have been panic. "You made me look like a fool," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "In front of Patricia. In front of HR. In front of everyone who matters to my career." I turned slowly, a wine glass still in my hand, and looked at him with perfect calm. "I didn't make you anything, Richard. I served what you cooked." The metaphor wasn't lost on him. His jaw worked silently for a moment before he exploded again. "This is vindictive. This is cruel. This is exactly what you did to me," I said quietly. "Except I did it with evidence and witnesses, not just casual cruelty over dinner." He stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, this woman who'd been his wife for 8 years but who suddenly seemed like a stranger. "You've destroyed everything." "No," I corrected. "You did that. I just made sure everyone else could see it." He left then, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. I heard his car peel out of the driveway again, and I wondered distantly where he'd go. To Melissa? To a hotel? I found that I didn't particularly care. I finished cleaning the kitchen, then poured myself a glass of the expensive wine we'd served at dinner and sat down at the kitchen table. My phone continued to buzz. When I finally looked, I found a stream of texts from Richard, dozens of them, arriving in rapid succession. The first few were angry. "You had no right. You'll regret this. I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are." Then came the gaslighting. "I never meant to hurt you. You're overreacting. We can work this out if you just calm down. Then the pleading, please. We can fix this. I'll end things with Melissa. We can start over. Just call off whatever you're planning. And finally, the threats. You want a divorce? Fine. I'll make sure you get nothing. I'll drag this out until you beg me to settle. You're going to regret humiliating me. I took a screenshot of every single message, backed them up to 3 separate cloud accounts, and then set my phone down. Let him rant. Let him threaten. Every word was just more ammunition. The next morning, I had a 9 a.m. appointment with Maya Patel, an employment attorney Lydia had recommended. Her office was in a sleek high-rise downtown, all glass and chrome, and the kind of quiet efficiency that inspired confidence. Maya was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with sharp eyes and an even sharper suit. She listened as I laid out everything: the affair, the dinner party, the evidence I'd collected, Richard's threats. When I finished, I slid a thick folder across her desk. Inside were copies of everything: the receipts, the expense reports, the calendar entries, screenshots of Richard's texts, and a detailed timeline I'd prepared. Maya flipped through the folder methodically, her expression neutral, but her fingers moving quickly. When she reached the expense reports, she paused. These dinners were charged to the company?
Yes.
I cross-referenced the dates with our personal credit card statements and with reservations at restaurants near Melissa's apartment. And you have the receipt with her handwriting?
Yes.
Along with several witnesses who saw them together at the dinner party before I revealed everything. Maya leaned back in her chair, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Clara, this isn't just infidelity. If these personal expenses were fraudulently reported as business expenses, we're talking about potential corporate fraud. The company will have grounds for termination with cause, possibly even legal action. Good, I said simply. Maya's smile widened. Let's talk about what you want. Not revenge, legally achievable outcomes. We spent the next hour mapping strategy. Maya explained the post-nup Richard and I had signed 3 years ago, when I'd inherited a substantial sum from my grandmother. Richard had insisted on it, ironically, to protect both our interests. The document included an infidelity clause that heavily favored the non-cheating spouse. With documented proof of adultery, you keep the house and your inheritance, Maya said. He'd be responsible for his own debts, including any joint credit cards he used for his affair. There's about $20,000 on our joint card, I said. Most of it from the past 6 months. Hotels, restaurants, gifts I certainly never received. Perfect. We'll request a forensic accounting to separate legitimate marital expenses from affair-related charges. He'll be liable for those. By the time I left Maya's office, I had a plan. More than that, I had a weapon. And I was ready to use it. Richard, meanwhile, was mounting his own offensive. He showed up at work Monday morning only to be escorted to Patricia's office by building security, a humiliation I heard about from Sarah, who texted me the details with barely concealed satisfaction. He tried to spin the narrative, I learned later. Told Patricia that I was unstable, vindictive, that I'd misinterpreted innocent work dinners and targeted Melissa out of jealousy. But James from HR had already been through my evidence folder. And several colleagues, including Sarah, Martin, and Tom, had submitted written statements about what they'd witnessed at the dinner party. The firm moved quickly. By Tuesday afternoon, Richard received an email placing him on administrative leave pending investigation. By Wednesday, HR had interviewed Melissa, who apparently broke down, and confirmed the affair. By Thursday, the firm's forensic accountants were going through every expense report Richard had submitted for the past year. Richard's response to all of this was to show up at the house unannounced on Friday evening, his face haggard and his shirt wrinkled. I opened the door, but didn't invite him in. "Clara, please," he said, and there was genuine desperation in his voice now. "You have to call this off. They're going to fire me. They're talking about making me repay the expenses. I could lose everything. You should have thought of that before you decided Melissa's company was worth more than your integrity," I said. "I'll end it. I'll apologize. Whatever you want. Just please. Tell Patricia this was all a misunderstanding." Was it a misunderstanding when you told everyone my cooking was terrible? When you spent our money on hotel rooms with your secretary? When you made me feel worthless in my own home? My voice remained level, but there was steel underneath. You made your choices, Richard. Now you get to live with them. I closed the door while he was still standing there, mouth open, searching for words that wouldn't come. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in months. I enjoyed myself. Lydia came over with wine and takeout, and we sat in my living room laughing at terrible movies and talking about anything except Richard. It felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd forgotten existed. On Monday morning, Maya called. The company is filing a civil action for expense fraud. They're also issuing a temporary restraining order preventing Richard from retaliating against any witnesses who testified to HR. Can they do that? They can, and they are. Apparently, he tried to corner Melissa in the parking garage on Friday. She reported it to security, and HR decided enough was enough. I felt a strange pang of sympathy for Melissa, strange because she'd been complicit in destroying my marriage, but genuine because I knew what it felt like to be on the receiving end of Richard's rage.
One more thing, Maya said.
I'm filing the divorce petition this week, citing the infidelity clause in your postnup. Are you ready for this? I've been ready, I said. That evening, I sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and my recipe notebook, the one I'd labeled second course weeks ago. It wasn't really about recipes, though there were a few scattered throughout. It was about what came next.
About rebuilding.
About creating something meaningful from the wreckage of my marriage. I opened to a fresh page and began to write. The divorce papers were served on Tuesday morning. The sheriff posted them on the front door of the house, and Richard, who'd been staying at a hotel since I'd locked him out, apparently ripped them down in full view of our neighbor's security camera. That footage, too, went into Maya's growing file. The HR investigation concluded on Wednesday. The email that landed in Richard's inbox was brutal in its efficiency. Termination for cause, effective immediately. No severance package.
No bonus.
His vested stock options were forfeited, and he was being billed for $43,000 in fraudulent expense claims, payable within 90 days, or the firm would pursue legal collection. Sarah forwarded me the gossip from the office. Richard had tried to access the building that afternoon and been turned away by security. He'd apparently made a scene, shouting about unfair treatment and conspiracy until they threatened to call the police. Melissa, meanwhile, had submitted her resignation. Accepted immediately, I heard, with the firm quietly glad to be rid of the whole mess. I felt a strange kinship with her in that moment. Two women whose lives had been upended by Richard's selfishness, though our roles in the drama were very different.
On Thursday, Melissa called me.
I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. Clara? Her voice was small, shaky. I need to tell you I'm sorry. I said nothing, waiting. I believed him, she continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. He told me your marriage was over, that you were just going through the motions, that he was going to leave you anyway, and we were just accelerating the inevitable. I know that doesn't make it okay. I know I hurt you, but I want you to know that I'm sorry, and that I told HR everything. The truth.
Why?
I asked. Not accusatory, just genuinely curious. Because you were right. At the dinner. When you served the truth. He made me promises too, Clara. About promotions, about our future. All lies. We were both just convenient for him. I thought about that for a moment. Thank you, I said finally, for telling the truth. That took courage. She made a choked sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. I lost my job. My reputation. All for a man who threw me under the bus the second things got difficult. Then we've both learned something valuable, I said quietly, about who Richard really is. After we hung up, I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time, thinking about the complicated web of betrayal and complicity and victimhood that affairs created. There were no clean lines, no simple villains. Just people making terrible choices and other people paying the price. But I was done paying. Lydia had been talking about hosting a charity event at her art gallery, a tasting night to raise money for a women's shelter. When she mentioned it, something clicked in my brain.
Let me do the food, I said.
Clara, you don't have to. I want to. Let me create the menu. Let me show people what I can actually do when I'm not being criticized at every turn. She studied my face, then nodded slowly. Okay, but let's make it meaningful. Each dish should tell a story. We spent the next week planning. I designed a menu that was part artistry, part metaphor. Candor consommé, clear and honest, nothing hidden. Red flag carpaccio, paper thin and impossible to ignore. Clean slate sorbet, cold and refreshing, a palate cleanser before the next course of life. Invitations went out to Lydia's usual gallery patrons, but also to people from Richard's world. Sarah bought 2 tickets immediately. Martin and Tom bought tickets. Even James from HR and his wife, Karen, RSVP'd. Word spread through the firm, and soon we were sold out, 50 people, all coming to a charity dinner that was also, though they might not realize it, a declaration of independence. The night of the event, I arrived at the gallery early. Lydia had transformed the space, soft lighting, elegant table settings, my menu printed on handmade cards at each place setting. It was beautiful. More than that, it was mine. I moved through the kitchen with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, plating dishes, coordinating timing, directing the 2 culinary students Lydia had hired to help. This was where I belonged, not in the shadow of Richard's contempt, but in my own light, creating something beautiful and meaningful. The guests began arriving at 7. I stayed mostly in the kitchen, preferring to let the food speak for itself. But I could hear the murmur of appreciation as each course went out, could see through the kitchen pass window as people tasted the Candor consommé and smiled at the name on their menu cards. And then Richard walked in. I saw him through the kitchen window. He bought a ticket under an assumed name, I learned later. His suit was wrinkled, his face drawn. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. Several people noticed him, and a ripple of uncomfortable recognition spread through the room. Maya, who'd been stationed near the bar as both guest and quiet security, raised an eyebrow at me. I gave a small nod. I'd expected this, in a way. Of course, Richard couldn't let me have this moment. Of course, he had to try to reclaim some control. He made his way through the room and cornered me near the kitchen pass, just as I was sending out the clean slate sorbet. Call this off, he hissed. Whatever game you're playing, we can fix this privately. Like adults. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt nothing. Not anger, not hurt, not even satisfaction at how far he'd fallen. Just a vast, calm indifference. We're in public because you chose to hide in private, I said simply. Everything you did in shadows. I'm just bringing it into the light. Clara. A process server appeared at Richard's elbow. Richard Hale? Richard turned, confused. Yes. You've been served. The server handed him a thick envelope, then disappeared back into the crowd. Richard ripped open the envelope, his hand shaking. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a notice of the company's civil action for expense fraud, complete with a detailed accounting of every fraudulent charge. The second was a temporary restraining order, preventing him from contacting or retaliating against any witnesses in the HR investigation or the civil proceedings. All around us, phones were discreetly rising. Not to record, Lydia had made it clear this was a phone-free event, but people were watching, bearing witness to this moment. Richard looked up at me, his face ashen. You planned this. All of it. I planned to move on with my life, I said. You're the one who couldn't let go. I picked up a bowl of clean slate sorbet, pristine white, elegantly simple, and set it down at the empty seat at the head table, the seat I'd reserved but left unnamed on the seating chart. This is for you, I said quietly. It represents starting over.
Fresh. Clean.
I suggest you try it. Then I turned and walked back into the kitchen, leaving him standing there with legal papers in one hand and the weight of his choices crushing down on him. Through the kitchen pass, I watched him read the documents again, watched the color drain from his face as he finally understood the full scope of what was happening. He tried to rally, to put on a brave face, but his hands trembled as he set the papers down. He looked around the room, at colleagues who wouldn't meet his eyes, at acquaintances who'd heard the stories, at Melissa, who sat in the corner looking small and broken. And then, slowly, Richard sank down. Not into a chair, but to one knee beside the table, as if the weight of everything had finally become too much to bear standing up. His head dropped, his shoulders sagged, and for just a moment, he looked exactly like what he was, a man who'd gambled everything on his own invincibility and lost. The room went silent. Someone coughed. A glass clinked softly against a plate. But mostly, there was just the heavy sound of truth settling in, undeniable and complete. I turned away from the window. There was nothing more to see, nothing more to say. The clean slate sorbet sat untouched on the table, melting slowly while Richard knelt beside it, finally understanding what I'd served. It wasn't just evidence. It wasn't just revenge. It was consequence. It was accountability. It was the natural conclusion of every choice he'd made, every lie he'd told, every time he'd chosen cruelty over kindness. And it was exactly what he deserved. Lydia appeared at my elbow, her hand gentle on my shoulder. "You okay?" I nodded, surprised to find that I was. More than okay, actually. I felt light, unburdened, free in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Then let's serve dessert," she said with a smile. "The real dessert. The one that's actually for people who appreciate it." I returned to my station, pushed thoughts of Richard aside, and focused on what mattered. The guests who'd come to support a good cause, the food I'd poured my heart into, and the future I was building, plate by plate, choice by choice. Richard could kneel in his consequences. I had a life to reclaim. The formal termination letter arrived in Richard's email 3 days after the gallery event. Maya forwarded me a copy. Richard had apparently CC'd her in a panic, thinking a lawyer could somehow reverse a decision that had been months in the making. The letter was clinical in its brutality: termination for cause, effective immediately. No severance package. No letter of recommendation. His unvested stock options, worth close to $200,000, were forfeited entirely. And the final paragraph outlined his repayment obligation: $43,000 in fraudulent expenses due within 90 days, with interest accruing daily after that. "He's financially devastated," Maya said when we met for coffee that afternoon. "No job, no severance, massive debt, and a divorce that's going to strip him of marital assets because of the infidelity clause." "Good," I said, and meant it. Maya slid another document across the table. "Speaking of the divorce, I've filed the petition citing the post-nups infidelity clause. Based on the documentation and witness statements, you retain the house, your inherited funds remain separate property, and Richard assumes responsibility for any marital debt incurred in furtherance of the affair." "How much are we talking?" "About $37,000 on the joint credit card. Hotels, restaurants, gifts, flowers. I've itemized everything that corresponds with dates you can prove he was with Melissa. The judge will almost certainly assign that debt to him alone." I did the math quickly. Between the company repayment and the credit card debt, Richard was looking at $80,000 he didn't have, plus legal fees, plus the cost of starting over with no job and a ruined reputation. "He's going to fight this," Maya warned. "Men like Richard always do. They can't accept losing, especially to someone they underestimated." She was right. The sheriff posted the divorce notice on our front door, the house that would soon be mine alone, and Richard arrived within an hour to rip it down. Unfortunately for him, our elderly neighbor Mrs. Chun had recently installed a Ring camera after a package theft. The footage was crystal clear: Richard tearing down legal documents, crumpling them, throwing them in the bushes, and then kicking the front door hard enough to leave a scuff mark. Mrs. Chun, bless her, forwarded me the footage without my even asking. "That man was always too loud," she said when she brought over cookies the next day. "You're better off without him." I sent the footage to Maya, who added it to our growing file. "Destruction of legal notice and property damage," she said with satisfaction. "This is going exactly how I expected. He's building our case for us." Richard's parents showed up on a Thursday afternoon, unannounced and clearly operating under the assumption that I was the villain in their son's tragedy. I saw their Mercedes pull into the driveway and briefly considered not answering the door. But I'd spent too long hiding from difficult conversations. Richard's mother, Patricia, yes, the same name as his boss, which had made for some confusing moments over the years, stood on my porch in her Chanel suit and pearls, her face set in lines of righteous indignation. Richard's father, William, looked more uncomfortable, as if he'd been dragged here against his better judgment. "We need to talk about what you're doing to our son," Patricia Sr. announced without preamble. "Come in," I said calmly. "I'll make tea." They followed me into the living room, looking around at the house they'd been to dozens of times for holidays and birthdays and the casual visits that made up family life. I wondered if they were cataloging what their son was about to lose, or if they were still convinced I was the problem. I returned with tea and a plate of the shortbread cookies I'd made that morning, a recipe from Richard's grandmother, ironically. I set the tray down and then placed a folder on the coffee table. The same folder I'd shown Maya. The same evidence I'd presented at the dinner party. "Before you defend him," I said quietly, "I think you should see this." William reached for the folder first. He opened it slowly, his reading glasses perched on his nose, and began reviewing the contents. I watched his expression change, confusion, then comprehension, then something that looked like disappointment. Patricia Sr. tried to maintain her imperious expression, but as William showed her document after document, her facade cracked. "He told us you were unstable," she said finally, but her voice had lost its conviction. "That you were making things up because you were jealous." "I have bank statements, expense reports, witness testimonies, and his own text messages," I said. "The only thing I made up was patience to endure it as long as I did." William set down the folder and removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "How long?" he asked quietly. "At least 8 months that I can prove. Probably longer." Patricia Sr.'s hand trembled as she reached for her teacup. "I raised him better than this." "I thought I married better than this," I replied. "I suppose we were both wrong." They left 20 minutes later, subdued and apologetic. William shook my hand at the door. "I'm sorry," he said. "Truly. You deserved better from our son." After they left, I felt a strange sense of vindication. Even Richard's own parents could see the truth when it was laid out plainly in front of them. There was no spinning this, no making me the villain. The facts were simply too clear. But Richard tried anyway. He leaked a story to a mutual friend from college, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, but who was apparently still in Richard's orbit. The story painted me as vindictive and calculating, a wife who'd overreacted to a minor indiscretion and destroyed his career out of spite. The friend, Jenna, called me directly. "I need to hear your side," she said, "because what Richard's saying doesn't sound like you." I met her for lunch and showed her everything. Not just the evidence of the affair, but the timeline of Richard's cruelty, the pattern of belittling and dismissal that had preceded my discovery. Jenna listened, her expression growing darker. "He's telling people you're crazy," she said finally. "That you've fabricated evidence. That you're only doing this for money." "Do you believe that?" I asked. She looked at the folder in front of her, then back at me.
"No."
"I believe you married someone who showed you one face and kept another hidden. And I believe he's now dealing with the consequences of his own choices." "Thank you," I said quietly. Jenna posted a carefully worded statement on social media that evening, not naming Richard but making it clear that she supported me and that anyone spreading rumors about my mental state should reconsider their sources. Several other mutual friends liked and shared it. The narrative Richard was trying to build crumbled before it could take root. Maya added screenshots to our file. "Defamation," she said with satisfaction. "Added to the list." Meanwhile, I was building something of my own. The charity tasting at Lydia's gallery had been such a success that people started asking when the next one would be. Lydia and I sat down with wine and spreadsheets and mapped out a plan, a monthly pop-up supper club, rotating themes, with proceeds supporting women rebuilding their lives after divorce or domestic violence. "We'll call it Second Course," Lydia said, and I loved her for understanding exactly what that meant. We scheduled the first official dinner for 6 weeks out, enough time to plan properly, to build interest, to make sure everything was perfect. I designed the menu around the theme of resilience, dishes that required patience, technique, rebuilding broken elements into something stronger. Broken hollandaise transformed into a perfect emulsion. Caramelized sugar that started as burnt mistakes. Bread that rose from careful tending after near failure. Every dish was a metaphor. Every course told a story. And every ticket we sold meant another woman somewhere would get help rebuilding her life. The response was overwhelming. We sold out within 48 hours. I had to expand the guest list twice. A local food blogger asked for an interview, and while I declined to discuss Richard directly, I talked about the menu, about resilience, about what it meant to reclaim joy after betrayal. The article ran with the headline, "Cooking After the Fire: How One Chef is Turning Pain into Purpose." Richard, meanwhile, was drowning. He'd tried to negotiate with the firm, but they were unmoved. The $43,000 was due in 60 days now, and he had no way to pay it. He'd applied for jobs at other firms, but word had spread. His reputation was toxic. He was effectively unhireable in his field. He tried one last gambit. He called Maya and offered to settle the divorce quickly if I'd agree to drop my involvement in the company's civil case. Maya called me immediately. "He doesn't understand that you can't drop their case even if you wanted to. The company's pursuing this independently. You're just a witness." "Tell him no," I said. "Tell him we go to mediation as scheduled, and he can explain to the mediator why he thinks fraudulent expense reports and adultery entitle him to favorable terms." The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at Maya's office. I dressed carefully, a navy suit, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back in a neat bun. Professional, composed, unshakable. Richard arrived looking like a different person. His suit was the same expensive brand he'd always worn, but it hung differently now, as if he'd lost weight. His hair needed cutting. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed. He looked, I realized with some surprise, afraid. The mediator was a woman in her 60s named Dr. Helena Ross, with steel-gray hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every possible permutation of marital dissolution. She laid out the basic framework. We discuss asset division, debt allocation, and any other outstanding issues. Her job was to help us reach an agreement without going to trial. "Though I've reviewed the case file," she added, "and I'll note that the prenuptial agreement with its infidelity clause is quite clear. Mrs. Hale's position is exceptionally strong." Richard's lawyer, a younger man who looked perpetually uncomfortable, cleared his throat. "My client believes the expense report issue is being conflated with the marital proceedings unfairly." "The expense reports are a separate civil matter," Maya interrupted smoothly. "We're here to discuss the divorce, which is complicated by documented, witnessed infidelity that triggers specific clauses in their post-nuptial agreement." Richard leaned forward, trying to catch my eye. "Clara, please. Can we just talk about this reasonably?" "I am being reasonable," I said calmly. "I'm following the agreement you insisted we sign. The one you said would protect both our interests." "I never thought—" He stopped, realizing what he was about to admit. "You never thought you'd be the one who cheated," I finished for him. "Yes, I gathered that." Dr. Ross pulled out a spreadsheet. "Let's review the assets and debts. The house is valued at $680,000 with a remaining mortgage of $290,000. Mrs. Hale is requesting sole ownership per the post-nups infidelity clause." "She can't just take the house," Richard protested. "The house was purchased partially with Mrs. Hale's inheritance," Maya said. "And the post-nuptial agreement explicitly states that in the event of proven adultery, the non-cheating spouse retains the marital home and any assets traceable to their separate property." Dr. Ross continued down the list. "Retirement accounts. We'd each keep our own. The cars, I'd keep mine, he'd keep his, though his was leased, and he'd be responsible for the remaining payments." And then came the credit card debt. $37,420 in charges directly traceable to Mr. Hale's extramarital affair, Maya said, sliding a detailed spreadsheet across the table. "Hotels, restaurants, gifts, flowers. all corresponding to documented dates and locations. Richard's lawyer reviewed the spreadsheet, and I watched the color drain from his face. He leaned over and whispered something to Richard, who slumped in his chair. My client cannot afford. Your client should have considered affordability before charging romantic dinners to marital debt, Maya said coolly. Dr. Ross studied the spreadsheet, then looked at Richard over her reading glasses. Mr. Hale, this is quite damning. Every charge is documented, cross-referenced, and tied to specific dates where you were, by your own admission, with Ms. Garrett. I'll need to set up a payment plan, Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. That can be arranged through the court, Dr. Ross said. But understand that until this debt is satisfied, it will affect your credit, your ability to secure loans, your financial future. We moved through the remaining items methodically. I would keep the house, my inheritance, my retirement account, and my car. Richard would keep his retirement account and his car, and assume full responsibility for the credit card debt related to the affair. We'd have no spousal support obligations to each other, a clause Richard's lawyer pushed for and Maya accepted readily, knowing I neither needed nor wanted Richard's money. The entire mediation took 3 hours. By the end, Richard looked hollowed out, physically smaller than when he'd arrived. Dr. Ross prepared a memorandum of understanding for both parties to review and sign at the next session. As we gathered our things to leave, Richard finally looked directly at me. What do you want? He asked, and his voice cracked on the last word. Just tell me what you want, Clara. What will make this stop? I considered him for a long moment. This man I'd loved, this man who'd systematically destroyed that love through 1,000 small cruelties and one massive betrayal. Closure that sticks, I said finally. I want you to sign the agreement, acknowledge what you did, and let me move on with my life. That's all I've ever wanted. He looked like he wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have convinced him it was futile. He nodded slowly and left with his lawyer, his shoulders hunched against a weight no one else could see. Maya and I watched him go. He's broken, she observed. He broke himself, I corrected. I just refused to keep pretending the pieces still fit together. 6 weeks after the mediation, I sent out invitations for a private dinner. Not a pop-up for second course, but something more personal, more final. I called it Humble Course, and the guest list was carefully curated. Lydia, Sarah and her husband, Martin, Tom and David, James and Karen from HR. And after some deliberation, Melissa. I called her to extend the invitation personally. You don't have to come, I said. But I think there's value in us all moving forward together, in witnessing the end of something, so we can properly begin something new. Will Richard be there? She asked, her voice small. Briefly. By court order. We need to exchange final documents. But he won't stay. There was a long pause. I'll come, she said finally. I think I need to. I also sent Richard a formal notice through Maya. He was required to appear at my home on the evening of the dinner to exchange and sign the final divorce settlement documents. The timing wasn't accidental. I wanted him to see what I'd built, who had stood by me, and exactly what he'd lost. The day of the dinner, I worked with the same calm focus I'd developed over the past months. The house was spotless, the table set simply but beautifully. No ostentatious displays, just clean lines, white linens, simple flowers. Elegant in its honesty. The menu was intentional. Candor consommé again, because some truths bore repeating. A main course of slow-braised short ribs, tough meat transformed through patience into something tender and rich. And for Richard specifically, something I'd spent days perfecting. Humble pie. Not the metaphorical kind, an actual pie. A simple tart with Meyer lemon curd, delicate and clean-tasting, with just enough bitterness to remind you that not everything in life is sweet. Guests arrived at 7. The mood was different from my previous dinner parties, lighter, warmer, free of the tension that had characterized my life with Richard. People laughed easily. They complimented the food genuinely. They asked about second course and my plans for the future. Melissa arrived last, hesitant and clearly uncomfortable. But Sarah, to my surprise, stood and hugged her. We've all survived him, Sarah said quietly. That makes us allies. At 8 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Through the window, I saw a courier standing on my porch, holding a large covered serving cloche. I opened the door, signed for the delivery, and carried it inside with gloved hands, a touch of ceremony for what was about to happen. I set the cloche on the sideboard and returned to serving the main course. The short ribs were perfect, the meat falling off the bone, the sauce rich and complex. Conversation flowed easily, punctuated by genuine laughter and the comfortable silence of people who'd found common ground in shared experience. At 8:30, Richard's car pulled into the driveway. The room went quiet. I stood, smoothed my dress, and walked to the front door. Richard stood on the porch, and up close, I could see how much the past months had cost him. He'd aged, gained a gauntness that hadn't been there before. His expensive suit couldn't hide the defeat in his posture. "Thank you for coming," I said formally. "Please come in." He followed me inside, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the gathering. All these people who'd once been his colleagues, his friends, now sitting comfortably in what had been his home, clearly at ease without him. I led him to the dining room and gestured to the cloche on the sideboard. "I have something for you," I said. "A final course, if you will." His eyes darted nervously to the covered dish and back to me. "Clara, Please," I said quietly. "Let me finish. I've earned that much." I lifted the cloche with careful ceremony. Beneath it sat a leather folio embossed with the words "Second Course," my new venture, my new life. On top of the folio rested 2 documents, the finalized divorce settlement and a single sheet of paper. "This is what I'm serving next," I said, my voice steady and clear. "The settlement you agreed to in mediation, ready for your signature. And this," I indicated the single sheet, "is an acknowledgement. Not a legal document exactly, but a statement. An apology that the mediator helped draft. It acknowledges what you did. The affair, the fraud, the cruelty. All of it." Richard stared at the papers, his jaw working silently. "You want me to sign this? In front of everyone?" "I want you to read it aloud," I corrected. "And then, yes, sign it. Or we proceed to trial, and the company's civil suit continues, without any settlement recommendation from me. Your choice." His lawyer had explained this to him already, I knew. Maya had made sure of it. If Richard signed the settlement and read the acknowledgement, I would provide a statement to the firm's legal team recommending they accept a payment plan rather than pursuing immediate collection. It wouldn't erase his debt, but it would give him room to breathe. If he refused, we'd go to trial, and I'd be the prosecution's star witness in the civil case. Richard looked around the room. At colleagues who no longer respected him. At Melissa, who couldn't meet his eyes. At me, standing calm and immovable in the ruins of what had been his life. His hands shook as he picked up the acknowledgement. He tried to read silently first, but I shook my head. "Aloud, Richard. We all deserve to hear it." He started to speak, and his voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I, Richard Hale, acknowledge that I engaged in an extramarital affair with Melissa Garrett for approximately 8 months. I charged personal expenses related to this affair to my company, constituting fraud. I repeatedly belittled and demeaned my wife, Clara Hale, both privately and publicly. I made choices that destroyed my marriage, damaged my career, and hurt multiple people who trusted me. I take full responsibility for these actions and their consequences." The words came out haltingly, each one seeming to cost him something. Somewhere around, belittled and demeaned, his voice broke completely. He had to stop, swallow hard, and force himself to continue. When he finished, the room was absolutely silent. Even the ambient sounds of the house seemed to have stopped. No hum of refrigerator, no tick of clock. Just the heavy weight of truth settling in. Richard's hand moved to sign the document, but his legs seemed to give out. He sank down, catching himself on one knee against the chair beside him, the paper balanced on the seat. His shoulders shook. Whether from rage or grief or shame, I couldn't tell. Maybe all 3. He signed both documents with a trembling hand, then remained there on one knee, his head bowed, unable or unwilling to stand. The position was so reminiscent of a proposal, that moment years ago when he'd knelt before me and promised forever, that the irony was almost painful. But this wasn't a beginning. It was an ending. Maya stepped forward and countersigned as witness. James, in his capacity as the HR representative, also signed. The documents were legal now, binding, final. "Thank you," I said quietly to Richard. "You can go now." He stood slowly, unsteadily, and I thought he might say something, some final word, some plea for forgiveness or understanding. But he just looked at me with eyes that held too many emotions to name, then turned and left. We listened to his footsteps across the hardwood, the sound of the door opening and closing, the engine of his car starting and fading into the distance. Then I picked up the small plate I'd prepared and set it on the table where Richard had been kneeling. "Humble pie," I announced to the room. "A Meyer lemon tart. Simple, honest, with just enough bitterness to remind us that growth sometimes hurts." I cut the pie into slices and passed them around. Everyone took one, even Melissa, who accepted hers with tears streaming silently down her face. "To second courses," Lydia said, raising her glass. "And to women who refuse to accept less than they deserve." Everyone echoed the toast, and we ate the pie in a silence that was somehow both heavy and light. The weight of what had just happened, balanced by the relief of it being truly, finally over. After dessert, Melissa approached me. "Thank you," she said softly, "for including me, for letting me be part of the ending instead of just the villain of the story." "We all played our parts," I said. "The important thing is what we do next." She nodded and left shortly after, and I watched her go with something that felt almost like forgiveness. Not for what she'd done. That would take longer if it ever came at all, but for the person she'd been when she did it. Young and foolish and believing promises that should never have been made. The other guests left gradually, each one hugging me, thanking me for the evening, expressing admiration for my strength. Sarah was the last to go.
"You did it," she said.
"You really did it. You made him accountable." "I made him face the truth," I corrected. "What he does with it now is his choice." After everyone left, I stood alone in my dining room, my house now legally and completely mine, and looked at the table. The empty plates with their traces of lemon curd. The wine glasses still holding the last sips. The evidence of a gathering that had been about closure, about witness, about the end of one story and the beginning of another. I cleared the table slowly, taking my time, letting the quiet of the house settle around me. When I finished, I went to my desk and pulled out my second course notebook. On a fresh page, I wrote the date and a single line. Today, I serve the final course. Tomorrow, I begin cooking something entirely my own. 6 months later, second course had become something I'd never imagined it could be. We'd hosted 8 dinners, raised over $40,000 for women's shelters and culinary scholarships, and built a waiting list of people wanting to attend. I'd hired 2 assistants, both women rebuilding their lives after divorce, and we were looking at permanent space for a restaurant. More than that, I'd rediscovered who I was outside of Richard's shadow. I was the chef who created meals that told stories. The woman who turned pain into purpose. The person who refused to let someone else's cruelty define her worth. I still ran into Richard occasionally. Our city wasn't that large. He'd found work eventually, though not at the level he'd once enjoyed. He drove a more modest car, lived in a smaller apartment, and carried himself with a kind of permanent deflation, as if that night on his knees had taken something from him that he'd never quite recovered.
Part of me felt sorry for him.
But most of me felt nothing at all. Because the greatest revenge, I discovered, wasn't watching him suffer. It was building a life so full and meaningful and joyous that he became irrelevant to it. Every dinner I hosted, every woman I helped, every perfectly plated dish I created, none of it was about him anymore.
It was about me.
About what I could do when I trusted myself. About the life I could build when I refused to accept less than I deserved. I closed the kitchen each night with a ritual. One last plate set on the pass, empty and clean, waiting for tomorrow's possibilities. A reminder that the most elegant revenge wasn't spectacle or cruelty or even justice, though justice had its place. The most elegant revenge was a life plated with peace. And that precisely was what I'd served next. When someone humiliates you publicly, do you stay silent to keep the peace? Or do you serve them the truth they've been avoiding? If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales about relationships, revenge, and the strength it takes to reclaim your life.